Sandra Meek is the author of 2 books of poetry, Nomadic Foundations and Burn, which are both available across the way at the book display in Ford Dining Hall, as well as the chapbook, The Circumference of Arrival. She was awarded the Peace Corps Writers Award and the Georgia Author of the Year Award for Poetry for Nomadic Foundations, a collection whose poems were inspired by her work as a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana. Her poems have appeared in many of America's top literary journals, including Poetry, the Kenyon Review, Conjunctions, Quarterly West, and Mid-American Review. Sandra Meek is currently a professor of English at Berry College, teaching poetry workshops and international literature, among other subjects. We are here to celebrate the Southern woman writer in the world. It is perhaps too much, going too far, to label Sandra Meek a Southern woman writer, too far to assign her a region, any region, but in transit, too far to call her anything but a poet in motion, a poet in the world. Hers are lines of motion, revealing an ear, an eye, a mind dynamic, processing and contemplation of the unsettled, which is everything. Her poems are a mapping of our unsettledness, the passages and crossings, the entries and re-entries of the restless poet mirroring the fundamental nomadism of human culture, uncompassed culture, fluently speaking Setswana and equations that escape gravity. Our common culture that begins as cave painting and proceeds in a flash to the interstellar. These are inquiries into an atavistic, spiritual, and epistemological nomadism that survives perhaps at times in spite of itself, as much in the movement of tribes through the graveyards and wounded villages that mark their imperfect liberation as in the quivering mirrored surfaces of American cities, of the mesmerizing space left by their landmarks' sudden disappearance. The dazzlingly precise poems of Sandra Meek illuminate these tensions in our constructions, theoretical, physical, mnemonic, tensions both terrifying and exhilarating. The points of near failure that are consistently revealed to the writer, Southern, woman, or otherwise, by the flash, the flare of entry, of being new and in the world. Please welcome my colleague and my friend, Sandra Meek.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that beautiful and too generous introduction. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start with a few poems from Nomadic Foundations, which Mike mentioned is largely based on my experience in Botswana. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there from 1989 through 91. You probably remember that was a period of a lot of change in that region of the world, and another south, Southern Africa. 1990 was the year Nelson Mandela was freed from prison and when apartheid finally started to crumble in South Africa. And I lived just across the border in Botswana from South Africa. The first poem that I'll read is the first one of the book. It's a very short poem. It serves as kind of an invocation to the muse. And I guess I should just mention that in Botswana, Setswana culture, gender roles are very well defined, even to the point of what's appropriate for men to eat and women to eat and children to eat. And this poem comes out of that. It's also about a gift that I was given when I was leaving Botswana from the school that I was teaching at, which was a goat. Gift. Because a gift is to be killed and shared, you did it. As men held it down, like a song, you slipped the grooved blade into its throat. until I believed only the dead could forget those liquid arias. Later, men ate the brain from its pail. I was given a sliver of the tongue that belled and that head roped to the tree as the blade narrowed. It tasted of river, a bed of mud, near clarity, stammering over stone. I think as Americans, most of the news that we get of Africa is in extremes. We see sort of the National Geographic wildlife aspect of Africa, the beautiful animals, and then in the news we see the famines and the civil wars. But of course, Africa is a huge continent with a huge number of cultures, 1,000 different languages, and all kinds of people just going on living their daily lives. And I think that's what we lose with distance. This next poem is titled Reply Without Gazelles, and there's a kind of a quote in here that I overheard somebody asking about what it's like to wake up and always have gazelles, at your door. Well, for most people in Africa, that's not exactly the experience of everyday life. And so this is really about the norm in the village that I lived in. It was called Manana, and it was a village of about 2,000 people. And there was no famine there, but there were also only 7 water taps in the village, and so all 2,000 people had to draw their water and carry it from the 7 taps. Reply without gazelles. A month for funerals. Lightning strokes striking tenanted fields. Each Saturday we passed printed pamphlets, faces coming off on our hands. Ray Modise, 70 years, a dark unpeeling, the sound of spoons. Mourning, one distant shot pierced the heart of, no. Mourning, we killed a bull for the funeral feast. Such a wide circle to feed. Relatives mud streaking the windows to sign grief. Inside the old story, the black-wrapped widow shaving children's heads. Scalps flickering, smooth bones turning, a loose socket, blank new world, the too familiar room. What it's like without. Women wake in the borrowed soldier's tent, nursing candles. Men by the fire, separation, small lights in the night. Cries of crowned plovers, this old habit of naming. What's it like to wake to gazelles every morning? Tell me about Africa. There was this funeral, a lightning storm, an old man plowing his field, first rains, dry ground, fallow rivers of termites. I heard them digging the grave, the laughing pitched against stones, a pearl-spotted owl stuttering against thorns, a sound unidentified moving through the unelectrified night. Morning turns with the shovel, din of roosters, the sun in a tin basin. We washed off death at the gate each Saturday, how we ate and ate. You might have been able to figure out from that I live next to the cemetery in the village. Every Saturday it seemed there were funerals. Unfortunately, it's become much more so. I don't know if you know a about the statistics, but Botswana has the world's highest rate of HIV infection. And the first AIDS deaths occurred during that period that I was there. When I first went to Botswana in 1989, the average life expectancy was about 65, and I believe it's about 45 or younger right now. Cheery stuff, I just realized. Well, to go in that mode, the next poem I'm going to read is entitled Amputations. And it actually came out of waiting for my mother to come out of surgery. She was having a mastectomy. But there are other amputations in the poem that have to do with memory, and memory of different experiences and places in Southern Africa. There are some references to Lesotho, and there are several references to Namibia. Namibia got its independence in 1990 when I was in Botswana. They're right next to each other. And it was a really fascinating thing to watch as they were creating their own identity as an independent country. So one thing they had to decide was what the national language was going to be. So the language that had the most speakers in Namibia was Afrikaans. And Afrikaans was the language of the Afrikaners in South Africa and the language associated with apartheid, the racist government of South Africa. So there was no way they were going to pick Afrikaans to be the national language. Well, there were German speakers as well, but German had colonized Namibia, and that was another sort of bad memory. Well, and they had the choice of picking an indigenous language. There were multiple indigenous groups in Namibia, so they thought, well, if they picked one of those, it would be like they were favoring that group and saying that the others were less. So they decided to go with English as sort of the international language. Well, the problem was only about 5% of Namibians spoke English. So they actually created a national language and told everybody, you figure it out, you learn it. And I was in Namibia in 91, I guess it was, and was listening to the radio, and they had a talk show, and the host was talking in English, and somebody called in and started talking in Afrikaans, and the hostess yelled at that person, speak in English, and hung up on them. So there was a lot of anger about this. So that's sort of woven in through the poem as well. You know, I just realized the first line of this poem is kind of weird, and I have never explained it in a reading. So maybe I'll do that just to be different. It starts out with a scar on my neck. And it actually is a scar on my neck where I had a brachial cyst removed. It's nothing, but it's sort of like the remnants of the gill that you have when you are inside your mother. And so that's actually where it comes from, this sort of transitional state that the body remembers when perhaps it shouldn't anymore. Amputations. The scar on my neck, a sign I've lost, whatever translates water to air. The body arrives as day, as desert, steeped in triggers and mines. The sea hangs on a tripwire. Again, I've remembered the mountains as meadows and streams, petals of stalled rain, forgetting my rented horse, gloved in fog, the village without roads, old men sawing limbs from a donkey. Winter was what made our breath a pale silk coffin, while the countryside paused, malignant with names. In the city, the war is over. Truck drivers, evening prayers, all that riddles the night. Only engines nearly stall. hazard lights tracing the skeleton of a code. No one speaks the new national language except tourists who wield kaleidoscopes from their pockets to clock all that new light to the same stars, the same bones of snowflakes. Still, I could have greeted the soldier idling before banks of windows downtown, his camouflage startling arid pains with memories of foreign jungles never traveled. No disguise for domestic wars, no instrument for abandoning the history of the body. Because I too was hungry and could not speak, I crouched and remembered grass, watching an old man saw limbs from a donkey. Red birds stammered the blades, skipped beats, sudden wings. Evening, they would roll your stunned body into this room. All-day waterfalls arrived as gray needles, the smell of deep falling. The last poem I'll read from Nomadic Foundations is dedicated to one of my students in Botswana. I taught at a new community junior secondary school, basically a junior high at the village. And this student was one of my best, one of my favorite students. And when I came back to the US, a lot of the students wrote letters, mostly just for the novelty of getting a letter back from another country. So that went on for a couple of years, and most of those just kind of faded out. They didn't keep writing. But Kitso didn't write me for several years, and then I got this first letter from him. And he said that he had been struck by lightning in a field, and it had literally taken him several years just to be able to talk about the experience. And so this is dedicated to him. Half-Life, for Kitso Yobone. When lightning burned a door in your chest, you didn't follow, though your cattle made room for your death in the bitten grass. All night you refused consciousness, the way I'd back out of my life those evenings pricked to small lights, abandoning the house on my bicycle, my left arm plaster bent to approach less the shape of the skating blade I had failed. Another object bobbled like the ball that lost its inborn arc at my touch. The winter sky crystallized to the vein at Owl Canyon, geometric needles of quartz constellating the sandstone wrist I chipped one summer to bits. So the bolt was a revelation. You turned first towards, then finally away, graduating to stamping incoming files at immigration, drifters you know by the blank of paper beneath the names. Kitso, even legends remain tainted by ladders and bandages, someone to carry you, white hospital cloth, a machine turned to go. Gauzy details through which I recognize the silence you took years to break, that atmospheric force ghosting your pen. As I returned to the house with its porch of ruined snow, you turned and walked back into the wreck you came finally to recognize as home, rejecting the white light, its room of shadows. Writing this letter, the lake of ice, pitted blue, the blade refusing the purity of silence and grace. The other life turned a mirror to the wall. The page torn by your pen echoes the mountain cracked by that emptied vein, surviving to this day the fossil of absence, what you kept closeted in the broken staircase of your ribs on turning away. I'm going to read a couple of poems from my more recent book, Burn, and then a couple of even newer ones. This first poem from Burn is entitled Tillandsia Neodes, which is the Latin name for, does anybody know? For Spanish moss. So we are returning now to the American South briefly. Tillandsia Neodes. You could walk under it your whole life and never know it flowers. Magnolias, waxy moons, eclipsing the blooms. Never know it houses chiggers, red flecks of dormant fire. Spanish moss, graybeard, thrives on fences, telephone wires, wine cemetery oaks with cursive scrawls weeping over block letters in stone. Don't we want to believe in living without the machinery of life, holding our breath through eternity at the bottom of the pool, unending time to make over each flailing fluid gesture to sign languages, precise fluency. Science, the art of elaborate misnaming. It's not a moss, but an herb related to the pineapple, as Irish moss is an algae, reindeer moss, a lichen, and the air fern's not a plant at all, but an oceanic skeleton dyed green. What we make in the image of this world is it art or descriptions drapery, Christmas tinsel stripped of silver to essence, shredded copperish paper, not a sachet of hair rescued from a lost beloved's ivory brush. Its unraveling nest composed of a single living thread, which in the end kills nothing, not a parasite, but merely a plant living on air. So weightless, it resists gravity, the curious hands loving destruction. The ephemeral's part of the illusion, part of nature's art, beyond our dreamed up uses, packing material, upholstery stuffing, the fertility doll's approximate flesh winding the flowering skirt's hidden stem, a muse for artifice, its soft embellished spine. Each loop leads through the next, a wad of ancient fishing line marooned in these trees during some archetypal flood. How easily the moment walking beneath ravels into forever, the way this sidewalk followed far enough would end an ocean, coral reefs, chromatic alphabet in endless revision, cobalt to cream, plankton's pulsing phosphorescent stars, the fathomless language of whales we hear as music. This next poem actually started in the process of writing from a memory when I was 4 of seeing my mother change a light bulb in the kitchen, and she reached up, and she had back problems already, although she didn't know it. She reached up and slipped several discs, and it was rather frightening as a 4-year-old. She just started screaming and had no idea what this was about. But so she broke her back, basically changing the bulb. So be careful doing such work. So as the poem was going on in its process, I started remembering other things about the kitchen and the family. And I remembered this game that my sister and I would play. My sister would fix some concoction in the kitchen while I was blindfolded, and I would have to taste it, and I would do the same for her. And so, I'd put like honey and sugar and raisins and stuff together, and she would have to identify what it was. And she would put like ketchup and vinegar. And my only excuse is that she was 4.5 years older than me, because I did play the game with her multiple times. I didn't catch on to the real point here. So, and then the final thing that I started thinking about with the kitchen was the science experiment that we did in first grade, I think it was, my mother helped me with in the kitchen, where you take a wishbone and you soak it in vinegar. Has anybody ever done that? See, the science curriculum is just failing in America. So you do that, and the wishbone just becomes all rubbery. You can bend it and tie it up in a knot. It was a great lesson, I'm sure, and clearly I have retained much of the knowledge of that. I think it had something to do with removing calcium, but not sure. So all of this stuff kind of led into just thinking about the kitchen, but also the relationships between various women and food. And so the poem kind of took its own direction at that point. The kitchen. On the night step, each extinguished snails a pearl and a silver cursive chain, something like rain threading the concrete. The body's empathy, abandoning color with winter, with night, the rainbow it makes of limit. Soaking wishbones in vinegar for science, my mother's newly fused back exerted the magnetic pull of damage, already beginning the slow ascent to froth and the lace of fall leaves on a forest floor. The girl who died at 15, at 50 pounds, bones nothing but brittle webs of absence. The untraceable circle has no circumference. Each pure moment implodes in its passing. Memory recalls only its own kaleidoscopic rephrasing of the fragments, childhood's paper swan pinned in the unstable eye of the storm, refolded into a music box where the girl is stuck back together in the pose of art. On point, the body's a needle, tracing a predestined groove. Each time the box is open to view her, dancing on a pinhead, so thin as to make room for the rest of the starving angels. As if the body, by disappearing, could become a soul. Predictable, the elements' reversal, the half-life of matter, entropy, and the universal tendency to retreat to a dark interior closet as the shattering windows are swept up into a glistening wing. Swollen with vinegar, the wishbones became supple as a ballerina's arched back, a rainbow's promise of a future without rain. I'm going to read a few poems from a recently completed book manuscript entitled Biogeography. And these poems come out of a couple of trips I took to Suriname, which is on the northern side of South America. And Suriname, it's South America, but it has many elements of Caribbean culture, and it's incredibly diverse society. It has Christians, Muslims, Hindus, traditional African religions, traditional Amerindian religions. It's just an amazingly diverse place. And this first poem comes out of a boat trip that took into the interior of the country, into the area where there are Amerindian traditional villages and also Maroon villages. There were successful slave escapes in Suriname during the time of slavery, and first-generation slaves fled into the rainforest and were able to retain many elements of African culture. So inside that ever-shrinking rainforest is really a number of rich cultures. Suriname was colonized by the Dutch, so the river has a Dutch name. Currentine River. Breathe in, and you are that clarity, cradled before word, before the fracture between rainforest and jungle. Transparency, our small boat hummed toward, away from the brackish coast, a town of rice, white waves of egrets, a tattered flag, rippling before tractors, palm-lined canals choked with algae, and lotus a red deep as the heart tongued open. Heartwood, what mangrove lacks, levitating low tide, ornate signatures rooted in the sweetness of salt. Such perfect balance, such perfect revolution. The eldest son lights the pyre, the old man burns on shore. Mangrove raises up the salt, sweats fine crystals from leaf tips drenched in sun. It isn't true fire is weakened by light. Even in tropical noon, those flames eclipse the white sand, slowly shrinking beneath the sea's unraveling hem. In the capital, revolution is a marble frieze, erected amid the blown apart police headquarters, surviving pillars. A beautiful woman in flowing stone robes, that archetypal iconography, not mother or lover, but virgin blessing the men's guns, the water cont she faces. Rivers are roads in this country. Whole villages exist only by water. 4 hours into the forest, we landed in the village Independence was to have flowered to a second Paramaribo. An engine of rust and leaf stranded near the stelling where we docked. The track's steel backbone, wood cross ties laid like a xylophone's ascending scales, disappeared in the green. Music never struck. Even the small monument I stumbled on, its gushing inscription dedicating the opening of West Suriname, nearly lost in Emerald's cursive scroll. Those same vines villagers hack to free a day's path. Maybe you've read how mangroves spread across this world simply by floating. Kashmir survived as the blue of his eyes, milk and honey and Krishna, the blue light of God, dipped into the panch amrit the widow offers each pair of cupped hands. Cane now entirely fringed, the sugar fields are ready to burn. The cattle have stopped dying of old age in the grass. Who's left to bury them with ceremony as they fall? The slaughterhouse, she says, is kinder than carrying off those soft eyes and their claws. Continental drift, the earth as steeled plates, crashing together. However you read the history of the planet, it all scopes down to points of ash, small fires dotting a forest village to keep the bush down. Next time you come, Sohan says, Apura will be bright, meaning the mine will be open. Already the men are here digging ditches for cables. Already a clearing, a satellite dish, cocking its ear, hooked to the harbinger the one working phone villagers keep arriving at on bicycles. Already the local prostitutes are overwhelmed. Despite the men's general shrug, they all have AIDS. The former dictator's party initials paint the walls, the imported American pine, at the guest house where the men overnight. Another election in the works. The night after talking to the woman whose lover was tortured and killed for his writing, I dreamed a head entirely face, 8 eyes encircling the skull, each stabbed out. In the forest, every little boy carries a machete. Things grow so quickly. The green springs back so fast. Without fire, without the earth mowers, the mine is moving in. Can, mahogany, purple heart. Everything that shades us will be cut down. In the city, houses go up in anonymous flame to keep witnesses quiet. The crumbling remains of government buildings burned long ago, left standing. No one forgets. What they saw was 2 decades ago. This year, the national census went up in flames. 2 torched warehouses, held as they were only on paper, the name of each citizen extinguished. Try holding your breath. Try saying nothing as everything comes down around you. Close your eyes. Even in bright sun, the world is milk, cloudless. Listen, do you hear the teeth approaching? Do you trust the light, how it eats equally into shadow and green? Have you noticed the body without air goes blue, letting in the sky? Now, there are a few references to Sandra Meek's recent history in that poem. This next one picks up on, so let me say a little bit about that. Shortly after they got their independence in the 70s, there was a military coup, and the dictator that was in place was advised to do something to really shake people up so that people would really be afraid of him, to kind of consolidate his authority. So one night in 83, I guess it was, he gathered all of his opposition at this old Dutch fort, 17th century fort in the capital of Suriname. And so there was like the dean of the university, prominent journalists, lawyers for the trade unions, very prominent citizens who were not happy with the way that the dictator was guiding the country. And they were tortured and killed that night at the fort. Well, 20-some years later, now 22 years, now 21 from the writing this poem, 22 years later, it still is an unsettled case. Just last year, they were trying to get this set for trial. I believe it has now been set for trial, but whether anything will really happen, it's hard to say. Everybody in the country knows what happened. Everybody knows that this particular man, who was the dictator, was responsible for this. Interesting enough, he also ran for president last year. And this also, despite the fact that he's been convicted in the Netherlands, in absentia, for cocaine trafficking. So he ran for president. He didn't win, but his party doubled their seats in parliament, which means there's a very strong support for him. And just one more little detail I saw recently, that before the elections in May the United States made the public comment that if this guy's party won, there would be trouble. And so, of course, gave him then the ammunition to say, you know, the United States can't tell us what to do. So a complicated kind of situation. But this fort, actually, this goes back to why there is such diversity in Suriname. It's because of the really horrendous colonial history of the area. The reason that there is African culture there is because of slavery. The reason that there is a rich Hindu culture there is because of the indentured servants that were brought in. And Fort Zeelandia, in its early years, was a place to torture non-cooperative slaves that were resisting by work slowdowns and so on. And they would do all kinds of lovely things like actually draw and quarter the slaves, hangings where the slave would be alive for several days, hung. And so this is just sort of a continuation of that kind of abuse in a new form. Fort Zeelandia, Suriname, 2003. 21 years, and no one has answered for those knocks in the night. For Leslie, for Joseph, for 13 others cut down to symbols of dissent. For Surendra riddled as sign, lead weighting his chest, and a shattered cross. For their voices hushed within these walls still laced with slaves' last breaths. Time will tell nothing of the stars the army plucked to stipple the olive skies of their shoulders. Unhinging thigh, hip, from foreign gods still constellating the night. The moon, thrown into relief, more deeply pitted, more like this fort wall, clean sockets, bullets bit into stone. What's left? The shooter's view. Shore's far green gesture, sapphire and grace, the wake of a small boat arrowed toward dock, delicate as a coin cutting glass, a finger signing fog breathed into a mirror. Because morning doesn't bring clarity, distance isn't perspective. At 10 paces, anyone can vanish, revolution a spinning toward eclipse. What can't be seen from space? The Great Wall crumbling, coral reefs boiling to oblivion, subway cars dumped off the New Jersey coast, trusting the lungless will rise once again to revise the rust. Some stories can be told only in oblique revolutions, a dark cell's memoriam, blackened lamp, a steady thumbnail of light until the oil bleeds away and the wick flickers down to a tongue of white ash. The smell of salt and toppled forest rises into rain. The coastal breeze, soft as moss, already weaving velvet of this chipped stone. The century's cataract, museumed in glass, apothecary bottles etched with skulls and crossbones. Danger as fair warning. The gun cocked on the shelf of the arm before the final view from the wall. Arcing above clay tiles, just the scalp of flamboyance, a shock of red blooms sprayed across the shivering green. I went to Suriname with a colleague, and I was present at interviews that he was conducting with the former dictator and the leader of the jungle commando forces and various other figures involved in the revolution, as the dictator called it. And also with surviving family members of some of the victims who were tortured and killed. And just a comment, since with the conference there are so many other writers in the room, the idea about some stories can only be told in oblique revolutions, I feel like I'm still struggling with that, with elements of that experience. The evening that we had the interview with the dictator, it was, I'm not sure, 3-4 hour interview. My colleague had a book that was published right after the revolution by one of the members of it. And what it was basically propaganda or a pro kind of view of this military coup that had happened, with lots of pictures of the members. And this guy who did the book fell out of favor with the dictator a couple years later, and he was actually one of the ones who was tortured and killed at Fort Zeelandia. So the dictator saw the book stacked there on the table and said, "Oh," and he started looking at it, and they all grouped around him as his ambassadors. The ambassadors are all looking like, "Hey, remember that?" You know, they're joking, just like you look at your yearbook pictures. But of course, he had killed the guy who put this book together. And that's a moment that I still feel like I would like to write about, but I don't know how to do it. Well, I'm going to end now, last poem, that also is a kind of transitional state. This has to do with traveling to Guyana and to Suriname and being on a plane that broke down, and they held us on the runway overnight. We got in the airport, I think about 10 o'clock, and it was 8 o'clock the next morning that finally the passengers mutinied and got off of the plane. They weren't going to let us off. They said that it was broken, they had done all these tests overnight, they couldn't figure out the problem, and so they were going to fly us back to Curacao, I think was where they were going to fly us back. But somehow that whole story, but we don't know what's wrong with the plane. We'll go back to where there's a mechanic. People don't really want to be involved with that. So this comes out of that, and also an experience sitting in this transitional airport, waiting to see if we would get another flight. Grounding. Oh, I should mention one other thing. Woven in this poem is Oklahoma, again, a different part of the South, where my parents are from, and a trip that I took a couple years ago with my father back to where they met, my parents. They met actually in a blind date at a mental hospital, but they say that they were both working there. My mother's a nurse, my father was an orderly. So we went back to see this part of Oklahoma where the mental hospital was. Grounding. All night I slept against his shoulder as they held us stalled on a runway, powering the plane down, system by system. Restlessness is woven into the body, vein by vein. But even at 30,000 feet, blood can clot and dam. Thrombosis, a bullet forged from too much stillness, a small bird flying hard against glass. All night passengers paced the narrow aisle, shaking their legs to stave off flowering into the lung, a rosette of blood, less slipknot than stone. More those rose rocks my parents gathered a half-century ago from erosion, a crumbling sandstone wing studded with iron-stained crystals beneath the city where they'd met years before a flawed diamond was tongued into its knobby gold set, before the affairs, the eventual inevitable break. 250 million years ago, seawater filled that void. Beneath the skin, earth is such emptiness. Limestone's brittle lace fragile as a sparrow's vial of bones. By morning, we'd mutinied, abandoned that broken plain for a city I'd known only as a small window of night, a bracelet of white lights dissolved now by dawn. In the terminal, the man I thought I loved told me what to eat and when, what to say to whom, in which particular country. I was watching for wings to silver the glass, for all the science I never could grasp, to radio in clear. How crickets can hear with their legs. How space is really the smallest unit of matter, and air just another ocean you can ride out its currents. How the earth keeps giving up crystals petaled in soft grit that nevertheless outlast history, while a seagull swept into an engine can bring a jet down. At the gate, he slept with his arms wrapping his body. I was reading Saturn's rings aren't made of light, but of snared moons ground to bands of shimmering dust. That summer, retracing my parents' younger lives, I drove past the Red Stone Mental Hospital where they'd worked, through what used to be countryside, good rock hunting, now a clutter of suburban yards, bricked fences. What I learned from my father, it's stasis that kills, and face cards are always the ones to keep. From my mother, self is just what doesn't leave you. What I taught myself between flights, to orbit any celestial stone is to lose everything but direction. On the margin of a neighborhood going up, the only roses I unearthed were failed partial blooms, one side ridged, the other smooth as an Amish doll's face. The maker leaves unfeatured to avoid sin, the graven image, as if God didn't know to go any deeper. Thank you. Anybody has a question?
Yeah, how did you meet me? How did you do that?
More bodies than the pilots. Yep. We got up and there's lots of discussion among the passengers about what to do. And the pilot came back and said, look, if you get off this plane, I can't guarantee you'll get on another one. And people said, well, we want to go off. He said, well, I'm the pilot. I know what's best. I know we can do this. But they'd spent all night on the phone with a mechanic, and had powered down each system. We couldn't find it. And there was no mechanic at this airport. If you ever go to Suriname, be aware of this. And there are these U.S. government warnings about if you go through the airport at Suriname that it is not FAA approved or whatever. And what I particularly liked about that airport is the optional, do you want your luggage searched? So if you don't want your luggage searched, you go on the other line. So you have both. You can pick the appropriate line to go in. So, but basically we just all said, we're getting off, whatever. And there were,
Did they open the door? I mean, what if they didn't open the door?
well, they had it open already because they were talking to people at the airport on the ground. Yes.
What does modernity mean in the Botswana?
It's not a single word. I believe it comes from a name. Ma is a prefix for a group of people. Often I believe it came from somebody's name in pretty dim history. Nobody really seemed to know exactly that was. The school, though, was Boswell Kosi, and Boswell Kosi means place where the chief died. And there was a famous little battle there between the Tswana and Afrikaner invaders where the Tswana won, but a chief died. But Manana is more blurry. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.